All right, one of the ways that we explain the relationship between population growth and level of economic development, and therefore typically the level of impact that that population has on the environment, we turn to something called the demographic transition model, or the DTM. And this is kind of really set up as a series of economies and demographic characteristics. And really, it starts with a first stage, believe it or not. And this model was put together by an American demographer named Warren Thompson, and he came up with this in 1929. And it really follows observed trends of birth and death rates throughout the world, putting them within a rubric of classification in a series of 3 stages initially, but that was expanded to include about 5 stages later on. And the basic idea is that each stage of the model has a different set of birth rate and death rate characteristics, which influence its position in the world as well as its demographic characteristics at the time. So stage 1 countries are usually those described as having traditional economies, which is really a euphemism for economies which are hardly, if even at all, integrated into the global economic system. These countries are typically characterized by having high birth rates, which are a function of a need for agricultural labor. And that agricultural labor drives, quote-unquote, traditional economies. And high death rates are due to poorly developed public health, poorly developed sanitation systems, so things like wastewater, contamination of drinking water, and also just kind of the hard aspects or the difficulties of traditional economic life. In other words, you work really hard for a living just to survive, and that is very hard on a person. Stage 1 countries have very low or even stagnant population growth due to the fact that birth rates and death rates are very similar. So they have a low population increase rate. So the rate of natural increase is always going to be below 1%. In Latin America, labor in stage 1 countries is primarily agricultural, which I mentioned before, and children work as well. So having a bunch of them is attractive because they're pretty easy labor to maintain, and education doesn't really exist. Industry is also largely absent. And because of this, public health and healthcare issues, because of this kind of characteristic of everyone working, and a lack of public health or severe healthcare problems, most deaths occur among the very old or during the first 5 to 10 years of a person's life. Life expectancies are lower, and that leads to stage 1 economies being pretty miserable. There aren't really any countries in the world that could be strictly termed stage 1 countries anymore, but there are parts of countries which might be. So in Latin America, the closest you can get are maybe Guyana and Suriname due to their poorly developed economies and low population increase rates. Remote parts of the Amazon are probably truly stage 1, places where there's not much linkage to the outside broader world. In stage 2, things change somewhat. They're very different from stage 1 countries, and they're often known as developing. There are a lot of these out there. The characteristics of stage 2 economies is an ongoing shift from rural modes of economic production to more urbanized ones. During this stage, developing economies often cut their death rate significantly because public health and sanitation improves, and then there's meaningful and effective fights against infectious disease. Food quality often increases, and food supply problems like famine are much rarer. And then, despite the fall in death rates, cultural change does not take effect as quickly as economic improvements, so people still have lots of children. This is a way of saying that people used to have a lot of kids because it was free or very cheap labor, and it takes a while for them to catch up with the idea that their kids aren't going to die and that they actually have some surplus labor. This goes on in a number of places in Latin America where children are still seen as beneficial in terms of household labor. You see it in rural zones of Brazil, and you definitely see it in Peru, Guatemala, and Paraguay to some extent today. Because of this kind of lag in reducing birth rates going on, high birth rates increase populations very rapidly, often at rates exceeding 2 to 3% of natural increase. Public health improvements and enhanced food security also mean that people survive the first 10 years of life at a much higher rate. and this means stage 2 nations are much more youthful as more children make it to young adulthood. And like I said, Peru, Guatemala, and Paraguay all share these characteristics. Suriname and Guyana are pretty much in stage 2 category, really, strictly speaking. Stage 3 brings even further changes. The stage 3 is often referred to as an industrialized economy, and it signifies a complete conversion to an urban-focused society with a strong emphasis on industrial production. Death rates continue to fall off as healthcare and public sanitation increases even more, but at this stage, birth rates begin to fall as well because cultural change starts to take hold. People realize that large numbers of children needed to work on a farm are actually more costly now because children need to do things like go to school. It used to be in stage 1 and stage 2 economies that the costs associated with having a child were less than the production they produced. But in stage 3 economies, it costs more to have children than they produce on their own in terms of economic value. So children aren't really an economically rational thing to have a lot of, which sounds really horrible, but this is kind of the way that the demographers explain this trend. And really it's related to the costs of having children increase. Schooling becomes necessary and they're not allowed to work, technically. A lot of times they still do, though, even in stage 3 economies. These factors, though, combine to lead to a much more moderate population increase on the order of 1% natural increase or 2% maybe. In Latin America, we see this in Colombia, Venezuela, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Bolivia. And the beginning of this stage is what's known as the demographic transition. It's essentially when the population trends make it so that birth rates and death rates begin to fall. And transition is completed when population begins to level off. And that means basically that birth and death rates have to fall below population increase rates. And I'll show a graphic that makes this kind of clear here in a second. However, there's another stage, and this is kind of an adaptation or an addition to the initial model, which was only a 3-stage model, and that's the stage 4 economies, and we call these post-industrialized. It's typically post-industrialized economies are described as the terminal final stage of the demographic transition model, and essentially they're highly urbanized. Does this sound like Latin America? You bet it does. More people live in cities than rural zones in Latin America. And these economies have very low death rates and low birth rates, which keep the natural rate of increase lower than 1%. Instead of being focused on industry, service and knowledge-based economic production is most common. Sounds a lot like the United States, right? Where we don't make things anymore, we make knowledge of things, or we help people get coffee. Anyway, things like maintaining urban buildings, roadways, infrastructure, they're all part of this. And also jobs where consumer trends are monitored and analyzed, food service, deliveries. These are the economic bread and butter of the economy, literally. And the basic transition is away from heavy industry and more to trade. Latin America and the Caribbean, there are some stage 4 economies, though they're often thought of as being on the cusp of stage 4. Although some have moved solidly into stage 4. Brazil and Argentina and definitely Puerto Rico are probably in that solidly in stage 4 category. Mexico teeter-totters back and forth depending on the economic conditions. And the basic idea is that economies at this stage have completed their transition to a stable population and a stable economy. And it kind of works out like this. So here we have our crude birth rate, which will fluctuate year to year, and our crude death rate. And in the pre-modern or stage 1 economies, these numbers kind of oscillate back and forth, and they're both quite high. And here would be the total population. But at stage 2, we see this big fall off in the crude death rate, whereas birth rates stay high. By stage 3, the cultural norms have caught up with the actual birth rate norms, and we see birth rates fall off as well. But at this point, we have enough people that we see increased population growth. Also, increased technology and medical care lead to people living longer. By the post-industrial phase, population levels off. Right? That's the basic idea. Recently, though, we've started to talk about the possibility that there's another stage to the demographic transition model, and that would be the deindustrialized economies. And these would be ones, the idea is that the basic characteristics would be that it's still highly urbanized, very densely populated, but death rates would exceed birth rates, leading to a decline in the natural rate of increase, which would be about 0%, almost no growth. And immigration becomes the only way to sustain economies, which is what most deindustrialized economies find themselves doing. There aren't really any Latin America, Caribbean examples, and actually, when we think about this, the United States would be one of these post-industrialized or deindustrialized economies without immigration, right? The only reason why we have a replacement rate, population increase, and a little bit more for growth is because of immigration in this country, which a lot of people don't realize. Many European countries have reached this stage and not allowed immigration, and they're actually suffering economically as they continue to maintain a closed door policy to immigration, especially in Italy and Germany. Japan is similar. Britain's a little bit more open, and because of that, they have a slightly stronger economy, right? What's kind of confusing sometimes is that demographics also lead to economics here. And so when we look at kind of, let's say, the youth of a population and the flow of wealth, or the makeup of a population, or its stage in the demographic transition is probably more accurate. Later stages tend to accumulate wealth from earlier stage countries. So Mexico is definitely not in the same level of development as the United States. It's not at the same stage in the demographic transition model, and we tend to tend to accumulate more wealth in the United States than in Mexico. Now, this is kind of a labored point to make, but we do see wealth flow from some of these countries to others, like Nicaragua very much doesn't benefit as much from trade with Costa Rica as Costa Rica benefits from trade from Nicaragua. But this isn't a kind of a rule of thumb. It's one that people like to make an observation of, but there are lots of intervening factors. For the next section, the next screencast, we'll talk about migration and how that relates to population change in Latin America.